That was a weird day. I'm walking around Dublin carrying a radio and listening to Bloom's thoughts. Each spot I'm going to, I'm running into other people carrying such radios. And then at 3 o'clock, a theatrical group did all the events that occurred at 3 o'clock in Dublin in 1904, and that's the chapter where Joyce emphasizes synchronicity most. He's got 19 events going on in 19 parts of Dublin, intercut with each other and all connected in weird Jungian ways, and they had actors all over Dublin doing these 19 scenes simultaneously. And people walking around with radios, with the scene being read by other actors, and it was like Dublin had turned into Ulysses, and you didn't know whether you were in 1982 or 1904, or what was Joyce and what was reality. That was a great day.
Hello, and welcome to the Hilaritas podcast, brought to you by Hilaritas Press. I am your host, Mike Gathers. Join us as we explore the world of iconic writer Robert Anton Wilson and the people and ideas who influenced him. Visit us at hilaritaspress.com/podcasts for show notes, links, and past episodes. In our last episode, Kurt Przybilla took time to chat with us about Bucky Fuller. And now we speak with Loic Wright, PhD candidate in 20th century Irish fiction and culture and Irish Research Council scholar, about Irish novelist, short story writer, poet, and literary critic James Joyce. With this episode, we conclude our 8-episode series on the major influences in the life of Bob as he journeys through Chapel Perilous as outlined in the book Cosmic Trigger. We started our journey with General Semantics and Alfred Korzybski. Bob read Science and Sanity over a weekend in high school, introducing him to the consciousness of abstracting and multimodal approaches to reality, and creating some early cracks in Bob the Dogmatic Materialist's foundation, which eventually led Bob the Skeptic to question the very nature of and assumptions built into language and quote-unquote objective reality. Next, we covered Wilhelm Reich and his bioenergetic psychology. Bob the Libertarian had a major awakening experience when the FDA dumped all of Dr. Reich's books, 30 years of scientific research, into a New York City incinerator in 1957 and burned them. Around that time, Bob the Investigator sought treatment from a Reichian therapist where he would have developed first-hand experience with the mind-body connection. In our third episode, we discuss Aldous Huxley, who turned on Bob the Shaman by introducing him to psychedelics, specifically peyote, in 1957, when Bob read a review of Huxley's Heaven and Hell in upstart right-wing publication National Review. Then we discuss Carrie Thornley with writer Adam Gorightly. Thornley and Wilson started out as pen pals and became close friends and partners in crime before Thornley slipped into the abyss of a Chapel Perilous of his own creation, threatening to drag Bob the Fool down with him. In episode 5, we touched on the life and times of Dr. Timothy Leary, who showed Bob the Skeptic a strict scientific approach to psychedelic experimentation, while later facing government persecution that greatly affected Bob the Libertarian. Then, in episode 6, we dove deep into the life of metaprogrammer John Lilly, who, along with Aleister Crowley, introduced Bob the Experimenter to the art and science of intentional brain change. And from there, we went on to cover Buckminster Fuller, who had a similar non-ordinary experience as Bob the Mystic, and whose optimistic, unorthodox, and relentless nature, laser-focused on raising the quality of living for the planet as a whole, seemed to deeply inspire Bob. And finally, we come to today's episode on James Joyce, whose writing style deeply influenced Bob the Maybe Logician's development of multimodal agnosticism. And with all that said, I'm excited to introduce our guest for this episode, Irish Research Council scholar Loic Wright. All right, Loic, welcome to the Hilaritas podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah. So we're studying James Joyce today. You're with the James Joyce Cultural Center. Is that right?
That's it, yeah. Do a bit of diverse work for them. So tour guide, marketing, admin, a bit of everything.
Okay. And is that in Dublin, I assume?
Yeah, so it's in Dublin. It's in the inner city around where James Joyce grew up for some of his life and went to school and then set most of his work.
Right, right. And how did you discover James Joyce?
I was in college in undergrad and I was actually avoiding Joyce as much as I could. So I went to UCD, which is very much the school that Joyce ended up going to, the university, and there are various busts and plaques and libraries named after him. So I, in my maybe slightly more rebellious phase, decided to avoid the man who haunted the hallways. Then one day I was just walking through Dublin City and there was a protest on, so my bus was cancelled and I had €3 in my pocket and I found Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man for $2.99. So I stayed in town until the buses were back up running and I read it, and I was amazed to recognize the street names that I was reading in, and it began there, I guess.
So there's something about the book written after the town you're in that really captured you.
Absolutely. Also, a lot of the buildings are still there and most of the streets are the same name or look the same in some regard, whether, physically or culturally in some senses. So I was kind of amazed. And I was like, I nearly said, geez, I found this unheard of writer called James Joyce for about half a minute. And then I remembered that he's everywhere.
Right. So James Joyce was a huge influence on featured writer Robert Anton Wilson, and was wondering maybe if you could walk us through perhaps a thumbnail of his early childhood and the influences, maybe what Dublin was like starting there at the time he was growing up.
Yeah, absolutely. So Joyce was born in 1882 in Dublin, and he was born in Rathgar, which was just outside the city centre, and it was a very well-to-do area, very leafy green, a lot of 3-story Georgian houses. And his family circumstances got progressively worse through his father's drinking and gambling. So the Joyces moved about 17 times in Dublin by the time Joyce leaves Dublin to study, in quotes, medicine in Paris. And basically, he moves from well-to-do seaside towns such as Bray or Blackrock into the North Inner City, which was really abject poverty, essentially, that he was being plunged into. And he moves schools a lot. He went to Clongowes, which was a fee-paying Jesuit-run school, and then got kind of shuffled around into a couple of rougher North Inner City schools until one day he's given a free ride at Belvedere College, which was another fee-paying Jesuit-run school. And Joyce was an avid reader as a child. Didn't always excel academically. He wins a couple of prizes for essay writing, and he often spends the money that he wins almost instantly on like a night at the theatre or something like that. And he goes abroad then, as I mentioned, to study medicine in Paris, and he doesn't really take to it in the end. He has to pay the fees up front, and this isn't something that Joyce and money isn't always a particularly fruitful relationship. So he moves back to Dublin when he heard that his mother was dying. And he kind of spends a bit of time around Dublin and reviews a couple of books. But he, early enough in his teen years and his early adulthood, had been writing these sketches of Dublin. He said Dublin seemed the centre of paralysis. And to answer your question about what Dublin was like, Dublin was still part of the British Empire at this point. It was the second city of the British Empire. And Joyce found it strange. Again, he said to his brother Stanislaus that Dublin has been a capital city for thousands of years. It's the second city of the British Empire. It's nearly 3 times as big as Venice. It seems strange to me that no artist has given it to the world. And Joyce really attempts to do that then for most of his life and his work. He wants to show that Dublin is, as I mentioned, this centre of paralysis. There's nationalists who don't really do much for nationalist politics so much as grieve the previous generation of nationalist heroes, so to speak. And he's very critical of that whole paralysis in Dublin at the time. He thinks it's not in keeping with the rest of Europe and also the world with modernity and experimentalism. And he rails against that for the most part.
It's interesting to me, moving 17 times and kind of going from the suburbs and middle class, as I understood it, to maybe the inner city and poverty, how that gave him a view of so many different aspects of the city.
Yeah, his first encounter with a sex worker in the local red light district in Dublin inner city. So a lot of that is the young Stephen, but also these things happen to Joyce. And as you mentioned, kind of getting a feel for the city, but he also gets to see then a lot of different sides to existence in Dublin. That he went from very well-to-do seaside towns into squalor, essentially. A lot of those houses in the inner city had been politicians' houses that were now vacant, and 10 families would get crammed into one room by the new landlord. Joyce really sees both ends of the spectrum in a lot of senses.
Gives him a broad perspective in which to present all these different points of view. Okay, so he's back in Dublin after a stint in med school that didn't quite work out. Is that right?
That's it, yeah. And he kind of floats around Dublin for a bit. He's approached by a man called George Russell, also known in Dublin at the time as AE, and he was a pioneer of what was the Irish literary revival. So as a little bit of context, from the late 1880s into the early 1900s, there was full swing of this Irish literary revival, and it was pioneered by big names like Yeats and, as I mentioned, Russell and Lady Gregory. And the idea was a lot of these artists were looking in two senses to accompany political nationalism with a cultural nationalism, but also to combat the prevalent notion of Irish people as being drunk, sentimental, fighting, kind of oftentimes apish images that were pervading British stage and British media. So there's this whole idea of going back to the old Celtic notion, old Irish folklore, to revitalize Irish culture. And Joyce is not particularly interested in it. As I mentioned before, he's more interested in the modernity and the experimentalism of Europe and the continent, essentially. So he's offered to write short stories in the Irish Homestead, which was George Russell's paper. It was known in Dublin at the time as the Pig's paper because it also had a lot of agricultural articles about various agricultural machinery and things like that. So Joyce was somewhat unwilling to have his name attached to it. So when he publishes his first short story, The Sisters, in August of 1905, he publishes it under the name Stephen Dedalus, the name he used in Portrait of the Artist. And he then continues to write more short stories for George Russell until he finally has the bones of what will be Dubliners, which is a collection of short stories, which he publishes in 1914.
Okay. But if I understood that, there was an urge to enhance the image of Dublin and the Irish, but rather than kind of going back to Celtic folklore, he wanted to bring a more modern take.
Yeats or Gregory were being too nostalgic and sentimental. In fact, they would often write about this amazing Irish peasantry, and that was the authentic Irish person. And a lot of writers after Joyce as well, such as the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh, would have railed against that. They said there was nothing amazing about the squalor of rural Ireland either. It was just this kind of rhetorical ideal that they imposed on it. One of the critics at the time, John Eglinton, said Yeats and Gregory made the rural Irish peasant the fetish of unsatisfiable desire. And Joyce saw a lot of this going on, and he wrote essays against it called The Day of the Rabblement. He was really against this idea of idealizing and romanticizing Ireland. He saw a lot of the dirty inner city parts. You consider the likes of William Butler Yeats were born to big Anglo-Irish houses. They were ascendancy born, and they remained most of their lives in ascendancy houses. And Joyce thought they were fairly far removed from the reality.
You started to mention politics a little earlier, and I think we got diverted, but was that sort of reflected through the politics as well? You mentioned this paralysis and kind of looking back in time, and
yeah,
seems like there's some nostalgia maybe for the way things used to be, but not really a forward movement. And Joyce,
absolutely. So I'm sure many of your listeners will know there was the specter of a man called Charles Stewart Parnell, who haunts all of Joyce's work. And Parnell was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party. The idea was they would secure home rule for Ireland. That was self-governance rather than from Westminster in the UK. And Parnell was well known at the time, and he was often seen as one of those heroes, following in the footsteps of Daniel O'Connell, who would secure Catholic emancipation, that is, new rights for Irish Catholics in Ireland. And as I said, Parnell was known at the time. He and his 6 party members filibustered for 45 hours uninterrupted in Westminster until British politicians finally considered what was the Irish question seriously, that is, Irish independence, or at least self-governance. And Parnell was then involved in a divorce scandal. He was having an affair with a woman called Catherine O'Shea, who was married to another politician. And when this broke out, the Catholic bishops denounced Parnell. And obviously Ireland was so heavily Catholic at the time, it split a lot of the country in half, pro-Parnellite and those who denounced him. And one day Parnell stood up in his party chambers and he said, "Gentlemen, I'm the master of this party," to which his very good friend and colleague, Tim Healy, said, "Yes, but who's its mistress?" And that was kind of seen as the final nail in Parnell's coffin. And he died in 1891, Dubliners said, of a broken heart. And Joyce's father was a staunch Parnellite. He was a very strong supporter of Parnell. And Joyce allegedly, when he was 9 years old, wrote a poem called Et tu, Healy, where he positions Parnell as a Julius Caesar-style figure and Tim Healy as the betraying Brutus. And the final lines of the poem allegedly had Parnell clamoring over these inept Irish politicians, and Parnell was this soaring eagle. So even if the poem doesn't survive today, we do know that Joyce must have been a very fun 9-year-old to be around. But his dad allegedly had the poem published and sent to the Pope. So Joyce grew up with this Parnell spectre as well, and it makes its way into the work, especially in Dubliners. There's a short story called Ivy Day in the Committee Room, which is about a series of nationalist politicians doing half a day's work and then drinking the other half of the day away, reminiscing about Parnell. And one of them says, "Come now, gentlemen, we all respect Parnell now that he's dead and gone." And for Joyce, that's kind of the crux of the argument. No one rushed to his aid in numbers the way he needed when he was being denounced. But now that he was gone, everyone elegized him and mythologized him in a lot of ways that he could have used at the time. And rather than do anything productive now, they were just stuck in these cycles of reminiscence.
Right. Okay. So that ties into the politics and the literary revivals. But Joyce was just like, "Look, folks, this isn't how change happens." Wow. So Dubliners comes out of that.
So Dubliners comes out in 1914. He finishes the short story The Dead, which is possibly the most famous short story in the collection. T.S. Eliot famously praised it as the best short story in the English language. And Joyce, The Dead is interesting. It's a little change of pace from Joyce because he is sick physically and homesick towards the end of writing Dubliners. And then he starts writing The Dead as something of an elegy to the parts of Dublin he did miss. He does feel that he's been a little too harsh on Dublin in some senses. And The Dead is an interesting story in that it's about a man called Gabriel Conroy, and he is a very forward-thinking European man. He wears galoshes on his shoes because apparently that's what they do in Europe. And he goes on cycling holidays to France and Belgium. And he's critiqued a bit in the short story by people who accuse him of not being particularly Irish. He doesn't go to Irish language meetings. He doesn't go to Connemara on his holidays. He goes to Europe. And he's called a West Briton, which is a derogatory term for an Irish person who wants to be British. The story shifts focus then and turns to his wife, Greta. And she remembers a young man called Michael Fury who sang outside her window, or who stayed outside her window until he was out in the cold and he died afterwards. And she says he died for her. And Michael Fury is the embodiment of an old Gaelic man. And then we have Gabriel, who's the new continental man, and Greta becomes Ireland, kind of being pulled between these two diametrically opposed poles, very much as I mentioned before. Joyce was looking at the revivalists versus the more European continentalists. And this is, again, Joyce is looking at Ireland has a choice at this point. And of course, Joyce's heavily Catholic education is influential throughout his work. Both of the men in Greta's life, Gabriel and Michael, are named after archangels. So Joyce always picks up these things that he's learned and acknowledged and kind of spotted throughout Dublin and puts them in his work. And so Dubliners is released after a lot of difficulty. The first copy was allegedly burnt rather than be published over a few obscenity, the potential for obscene language and to be called up on charges and that, because publishers could get a lot of trouble over those. And so then he starts working away on a few different projects. He's released a book of poems in 1907. They're middle of the road. He doesn't get too much acclaim for them. He also writes a play, but the main work at the moment is on A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. And this is, as I mentioned, this semi-autobiographical novel about Stephen Dedalus and his essentially coming of age, learning about Dublin in a colonial city. And it sets up a lot of the themes we'll see in Joyce's famous novel Ulysses, but also the fact that Ulysses actually has a lot of stories with Stephen Dedalus in it. There is a continuation of that.
Can you give us a highlight of some of the themes that start to come out in Portrait of an Artist?
Yeah, so there's a Christmas dinner scene in Portrait where Stephen's father and his father's friend get into an argument with Dante Reardon, who is in the house with them. And basically, Stephen and his father are the pro-nationalists, and Dante is a pro-Catholic, and she denounces Parnell. She said good that they, denounced Parnell, that the Catholic bishops did. And then there's this tension that Stephen sees when he's growing up. He sees members of the family arguing over two central tenets of Irish life, which are nationalism and religion at the time, especially Catholicism. And Mr. Casey, Stephen's father's friend, says we're a priest-ridden race. And so early enough in his life, Stephen is seeing how there is a battle for who can be nearly second in command in Irish society after British administration, whether it's nationalist politicians or if it's Catholicism. And Stephen certainly, he goes to Catholic school and he goes to retreats, Catholic retreats. And by the time he's college going age, he's pretty sickened with religion in a lot of senses. And he speaks to his friend Davin. And Davin is the model young Irish man. He speaks Irish, he plays hurling, he's Catholic, nationalist. And Davin says to Stephen, why won't you be one of us? And he's really upset that Stephen seems so intent on walking away. I often tell my students, Stephen Dedalus would love listening to The Cure if he were around today. He's a real navel gazer. And so Stephen says, every time someone has made attempts to revitalize Irish nationalism or, bring Irish culture forward, they've been thrown to the dogs. He said, if I were to, you want me to be one of you, I'd see you damned first. And he says, you speak to me of nationalism or religion, language. These are nets that are thrown at the soul of a man to keep him from flight. I shall attempt to fly by those nets. Now, it's interesting enough that he says fly by because we don't know if he means fly past or fly by using them. And when we think of Joyce, we always think of language and religion. So there is a double meaning there, which is very typical of Joyce, but it's very much this idea of wrestling with who you want to be and who your society will let you be is essentially what Portrait of the Artist is about.
Interesting. So it seems like where Dubliners was trying to bring Dublin out into current times, maybe Portrait of an Artist is taking a look at Ireland as a whole and kind of a bigger perspective. And it's like we're subservient to the British, unfortunately, as you mentioned, they're kind of like number one, but the fight for number two. And is it the Catholic Church out of Rome or is it the nationalists in Ireland who stand up for Ireland?
In Ulysses, Stephen says, I am the servant of two masters, one Italian and one English. So he kind of, brings this up again. And it's something that kind of haunts Stephen in a lot of ways throughout both novels.
Wow, I never quite thought of it like that, but that's feeling like an occupied nation on two fronts.
Absolutely.
And as we're moving on then, and that was kind of Portrait of an Artist, and the germination of this, as you put it, nationalist versus religion duality, which I think permeates a great deal of Ulysses as well, right?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Was that his next project after Portrait of an Artist,
It
Ulysses? Or?
was. So he's kind of working away on Ulysses in various guises from early enough, nearly as early as about 1912, if not earlier. But so he kind of does a little bit here and there. He also publishes a play called Exiles in 1918, which doesn't come to much. There's an early German production of it, I think in 1923. And William Butler Yeats refuses to put it on in the Abbey. He just doesn't think it's particularly suited to what the Abbey do. And to be fair, it is very, again, European play. It's, indebted to Ibsen and a lot of these more continental experimental playwrights, whereas, a lot of what's going on at the Abbey is cultural propaganda in a lot of senses. But yeah, it's really Ulysses that's occupying most of his time. And Ulysses is an 18-chapter book that takes place in one day, which is the 16th of June, 1904, which is famously the day that Joyce went on his first date with his wife, Nora Barnacle. A lot of the idea is that highbrow literature had a certain reputation, and Joyce wants to look at just the everyday, that there's art in the everyday. He said in letters to his brother, he wanted to transform the daily bread of everyday life into something with a permanent artistic life of its own. And a lot of this idea is, in the novel, very little is not relatable. It's about a man called Leopold Bloom. He gets up, he has breakfast, he laughs, he avoids people, he gets embarrassed. Everything there is relatable. It's just a human being's day on earth. But it's also worth noting that Joyce said he had put so many enigmas and puzzles in it that it would keep the scholars arguing for centuries, which was the only way to preserve his immortality, So throughout the novel, there are some wildly experimental sections. There's a scene in the novel where it's set in a maternity hospital, and Joyce writes it mimicking the development of English prose literature, the Augustinian period into the kind of more Victorian. It's amazing, and it's following the gestation of the children in the maternity hospital, but also of the English language in a lot of ways. There's also a section which is obviously the most famous chapter, possibly, is the Molly Bloom chapter, which is the final chapter. And it's about Leopold Bloom's wife and her inner thoughts. And it's 8 full stops over, obviously, depending on the edition you have, but about 60 pages sometimes. And it just runs through in this inner monologue, because obviously you don't stop or start thinking, you just keep going. And that was also what was seen as kind of some of the more famous examples in his novel. Now, the novel was serialized in the Little Review periodical from about 1918 to about 1920, but there were some passages deemed obscene, and that halted the serialization. Joyce famously said, if Ulysses isn't fit to read, then life isn't fit to live.
Wow.
I haven't put anything in here that nobody else has done. It's just I'm writing about the minutiae of every day kind of thing.
I'm struck with somebody at this point that must be pretty established in their career as a writer to be able to take such big experimental leaps with such confidence. Is that?
Yeah, so he has a publisher now lined up, Sylvia Beach. It's funny hearing her interviews. He sounds fairly self-assured in a lot of ways. She said he was sitting in Shakespeare & Co., the famous bookshop in Paris where Hemingway used to sleep. And he sits there with his head in his hands about the halting serialization. And he says, no one's going to publish my book. And then she said, do you want me to? And he just, without batting an eye, says yes. So he was obviously kind of inching towards her to offer that. And he has a lot of friends, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis are providing him with packages of money. Oftentimes he does spend them in one go on the first night on a lavish dinner with the writers, and oftentimes his wife Nora Barnacle sometimes has to sell clothes just to feed the children kind of thing. So he does have a confidence about him for sure, you know, as early as writing Dubliners, when a publisher was refusing to publish the collection, he said, "I do not doubt that you will severely retard the course of civilization in Ireland if you do not publish my book." And there's another story, whether apocryphal or not, about hearing that reference to the king in Dubliners was going to cause it to be banned. Joyce allegedly wrote to the king to check if this was true, and he allegedly got a reply from the secretary that said it's not customary for the region of England or the King of England to respond to such matters. So absolutely, there's an establishment in himself and a confidence, I think, in writing this, and not really wanting to budge for a lot of people,
right?
Compromising his artistic vision.
That's what I was starting to get listening to you, is that maybe it was a more of an inner confidence and a refusal to compromise on what he wanted to do, rather than my first assumption is maybe that he was more established as a writer and recognized externally, but it sounds like he was still struggling along at that point.
Yeah, and bear in mind, he was very meticulous in his writing. He wasn't churning out any old dribble and claiming it was great. You know, there's another story where his friend Frank Budgeon came to visit. Again, you have to take a lot of these with a pinch of salt, because especially with Joyce in Dublin, everyone knew him all of a sudden. It was fashionable to know him. But Frank Budgeon said, "How did the writing go today, Jim?" And James said, "Really well. I wrote 2 sentences." And he said, "You only wrote 2 sentences?" He said, "Well, I actually wrote them yesterday, but today I decided on the final order of the word." So whether it's true or not, it does indicate the meticulous attention to detail, that he was really thinking about everything he put in.
Is there much known about his writing style or his brainstorming, or how he came to write these books?
Yeah, so funny enough, there's a new enough museum that opened up in Dublin probably about 2 years now, called Molly, which is named after Leopold Bloom's wife, but also it's Museum of Literature Ireland. And they have a lot of the manuscripts, and you can see him scribbling out so much with red marker and adding in things, and sometimes they look like fairly trivial things. It could be the color of someone's garment, but again, he's putting in a lot of thought into them, bearing in mind the structure of Ulysses is loosely based on Homer's Odyssey, and so he's putting parallels into 1904 Dublin from ancient Greek myths. So he's really thinking about it, and sometimes, you know, he kind of thinks he makes mistakes and he goes back and he changes it. He sends a letter back to his Aunt Josephine asking her, so I say sends back a letter, it's worth noting he's writing all of this from Paris, Pola, Trieste, Zurich. He's moving around the continent. He rarely returns home to Dublin. But he sends a letter back to his Aunt Josephine and says, would it be possible for someone of average height and build to drop themselves down the area railings of number 7 Eccles Street without getting hurt? That's because he writes it into his novel. Leopold Bloom forgets his keys and has to do that. And so he is really checking. He wants to make sure no one's going to kind of call him out on anything wrong. And he brings with him a book called Tom's Directory, which is this huge tome of all the addresses of businesses in Dublin at the time in 1904. So he can say, okay, I know that there was a business operating at this address in 1904, so I can't feasibly put a character living at that address. So he's really meticulous. To answer your question, there is a certain process of going back. He's allegedly making edits right up to the publication of Ulysses 1922.
I love this idea that he's living across in the continent, but he took basically the phone book with him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right, to keep on top of things.
As I said, a handful of times, one of which is 1909 to open Dublin's first cinema, which is the Volta Cinema. Now he kind of undershoots or kind of maybe overestimates the Dublin population's interest in foreign film, and it doesn't really do particularly well. In fact, it goes under. But it's just interesting that someone we associate with literature opens Dublin's first cinema. You know, it seems like something
right.
He put himself out of business doing.
So let's see here. What were there other early major influences? I get Parnell as a major influence, and he had maybe not influences, but supporters like Ezra Pound, that were supporting him.
Yeah, absolutely. So he does nearly, appreciate some of the authors in Dublin at the time. He meets Yeats again, whether it's true or not, and they have a brief discussion on artistic vision. And he's, if it's to be believed, he's less than complimentary about Yeats. He says, I have met you too late. You're too old for me to have any influence on you. Bearing in mind, Yeats is like 38 at this point, so Joyce is being an absolute savage young critic. But he is quite interested, as I mentioned, in the more continental writers. So Henrik Ibsen is a huge influence. In fact, Joyce was a fan of Ibsen's The Doll's House play about a character called Nora who leaves her family at the end, and he was quite taken by Nora Barnacle, his future wife, because she had the same name as one of his literary, heroes, and he allegedly taught himself Danish to be able to speak to send Henrik Ibsen a letter and to read the translations, or to avoid reading the translations. So he has quite a wide array of influences. He is often, there's a library in Dublin called Marsh's Library, which has been there since the 1600s, and they have a roster of who came in and what they read. And Joyce is in there reading heresy pamphlets published by the Catholic Church in the 1500s kind of thing. So he has a very broad interest, and he reads a lot of philosophy. So his interest in kind of more parochial or Dublin-centric literature isn't always as important as his more wide-ranging influences. A lot of French writers as well, Zola kind of things. He would be interested by those. So he studies Italian and French in university. He was able to read Sanskrit as well, apparently. There are various estimates. I've seen between 12 and 17.
Wow.
With varying levels of fluency, obviously, and Irish, of course.
Right. Wow. Okay, so Ulysses comes together.
Yeah.
And that sounds like something that took a while to work on while he was doing some other things, worked on the play. And
definitely, it's also physically taxing on him. His eyesight is quite bad. He had a number of surgeries on his eyes, and he's just quite jaded by the end of the publication of Ulysses. So it's published in February 1922 on his 40th birthday. He says in a letter to his patron, Harriet Weaver Shaw, that it's about a year later that he sends her a letter, and he says, I wrote the first piece of writing since the publication of Ulysses. But at this point, his eyesight has gotten so bad, he's having to write it out in red crayon on a huge piece of paper just so he can see what he's writing. And he often has to wear a white surgical gown and stand by the window just to let the light bounce off the gown and onto the page, because his eyesight has gotten so bad. He names his daughter Lucia after the patron saint of light. So as well as, mentally draining, physically, it's getting quite bad for his eyesight. And obviously, as he moves into writing his final work, Finnegans Wake, he's having to move around then because of, obviously, the outbreak of the Second World War. He gets a secretary for a while who writes down a lot of what Joyce dictates and will later become Finnegans Wake. The secretary briefly dates Joyce's daughter Lucia, but it becomes quite apparent that he's more interested in the writing, and that is because he was a young Samuel Beckett. So Samuel Beckett was Joyce's secretary for a while, and then on one occasion, for example, Beckett was stabbed in Paris, and Joyce paid for a very good room in the hospital to look after him. And a lot of Beckett's work then is kind of influenced by Joyce. Beckett says Joyce was a synthesizer. He put everything in. I'm an analyzer. I take everything out.
Wow. I don't know if this holds much water, but I've heard Ulysses compared. It's a typical day in Dublin, and the contrast that I heard is that that's the day book, and Finnegans Wake is like the night book, the dream book. And it struck me losing his sight around this time, and that he's starting to write a night book, a dream book.
Yeah, definitely. So that's definitely one of the, and it is quite nice to think of them in companion pieces, I think, in that sense. Finnegans Wake is also where a lot of critics would say that Joyce becomes bored with the English language. He's done everything he can do in Ulysses with English, and by Finnegans Wake, he's making his own. And in a lot of senses, it's true. If you read Finnegans Wake, he has words that he calls portmanteau words. So he just crams two words together to make a new word. So instead of absent-minded, he says absent-minded because he was a fan of absinthe drink.
Oh.
He also had laugh tears, which I often think of that crying, laughing emoji that people often use. That's Joyce was a kind of precursor to that. So he's cramming together a lot of the language, and he has what's called thunder words in Finnegans Wake. And they're often these words that are made up of, so it's meant to sound like thunder, and they're made up of various different languages, and they're words for thunder. And there's this huge running theme of the Tower of Babel, of all the languages put together. And Joyce is nearly reconstructing the Tower of Babel in these thunder words, cramming together all these languages again. And he really, exhausts himself and the novel form generally in that book.
I've never quite heard the melding of various languages and like going back to the Tower of Babel and almost like recreating history in a way.
Yeah, definitely. So that whole book is really Joyce's playing with language. And he does say allegedly after that his next book after Finnegans Wake was just going to be a short, simple book. Obviously, we never got to see it because he dies in 1941 after a tumultuous, moving period. Also, his daughter Lucia is in and out of mental asylums. So he spends a lot of money on getting her the best possible care, and he dies in Zurich in 1941. So he never gets to kind of produce that next book, I should say.
How old was he?
58.
58. So pretty young.
Yeah, absolutely. People often assume that he was a Nobel Prize winner, but never was.
When did you say he was really truly recognized?
It's hard to know because he was so unfashionable in Ireland for so long. I mean, in a lot of ways, there were some trials over people said that they were slandered in Ulysses because so much of it is real people. There are real Dublin characters in the book. In 1954, I think the BBC broadcast a radio version of Ulysses, and a member of the Dublin public got in contact and said, "This is slanderous. That's my family member you're talking about." And so it bred a lot of controversy. Also, bear in mind, Ulysses was banned in the States for obscenity until 1933. Actually, it's unbanned around the same time as Prohibition is repealed. So there's certainly a loosening of restrictions there at a pretty similar time. But again, it's kind of unfashionable to like Joyce. He's often seen as the one who wrote the dirty book. Very little is done about, commemorating him, unless it's kind of smaller private events. Like 1954 sees the first Bloomsday, which is the celebration of the day that Joyce sets Ulysses. And it was carried out by a group of Irish writers, Patrick Kavanagh, Flann O'Brien, Anthony Cronin, and Joyce's cousin, Tom Joyce, and who was a dentist, and A.J. Leventhal, who was a critic. And they just went around Dublin, kind of semi-followed the route of the novel, and also stopped in most Dublin pubs throughout the day. There's some pretty harrowing footage on YouTube of all the writers, and they can barely stand straight. Like, you know what I mean? It's a half literary pilgrimage, half something else entirely. So certainly a lot of American critics are really influential in kind of bringing Joyce into a more recognizable space. Richard Ellman, Hugh Kenner, huge amount of American scholarship really brings it up. And then, it permeates everywhere. Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes got married on Bloomsday as a tribute to Joyce,
Would you say most of the recognition then came posthumously?
Yes. His grandson, who had the estate, was, and understandably often, just a little suspicious about where it was coming from when people wanted to commemorate him. Was it to commemorate him, or was it simply for profit? So it was often quite difficult in Dublin and Ireland generally to kind of work on or talk about or commemorate Joyce for a long time. It kind of opened up entirely then, and you see annual Bloomsday celebrations then.
We've been studying a few people that I would say are ahead of their time. It sounds like this is another one of those people that just doesn't so far ahead that they don't quite get the recognition they deserve during their lifetime.
Yeah.
As I understand it, having not necessarily the background to put this in perspective, but that Joyce really changed how literature was done. That there was an objective narrator prior to Joyce, and that Joyce kind of created this multi-dimensional, if you might say, multi-perspective view on things.
Yeah.
Subjective nature of reality.
That was the thing Joyce was quite interested in as well, is the idea of different views and the idea of parallax, seeing one thing from a different perspective. And in Ulysses, a character will see a cloud, and later on a different character will see the same cloud. It's this idea of how people see different things. And Joyce often also complicates things we see as inherently true. So especially, 1900s, most novels were an omniscient narrator or a first person narrator. And the opening sentence of his famous short story, The Dead, is Lily, the caretaker's daughter, was literally run off her feet. Now, Joyce wouldn't be the famous author he is if he was misusing the word literally. Lily's much more likely to misuse the word literally than James Joyce, celebrated author, will be. And he does that in Portrait of the Artist as well. Sometimes the words in the narration just don't sound like something an impartial reader would say. It's something Stephen, the snotty undergrad, would say, So he's certainly interested, and he explodes it in a lot of ways. And, a lot of writers, Irish writers, have since said, in Ireland, if you're a writer, you're confronted with ignoring Joyce or tackling him head on and kind of folding it into your own work in some sense. But it's hard, to do anything but one or the other.
No middle ground there.
Yeah.
Moving back to Finnegans Wake, so we've got a man here that knows 12 to 17 languages, and we mentioned the Tower of Babel and the Thunder words, and I'm not sure what my question is, but it seems like that depth of or variety of languages is going to really play into how he manipulated language with Finnegans Wake.
Yeah, and there's an immense musicality to his work as well, and he folds that in with the language, you know what I mean? So like Ulysses has French, it has Italian, it has German, has Irish, and then it also has songs. Like Joyce was a very musical person, and he heard the musical aspect of language, and especially different languages, and folding them in to one another. He performed at a music festival in Cork in 1904 and won a bronze medal for his singing. Allegedly gave it back because he thought he deserved gold. But so he's always conscious in what he's doing and how everything meshes together, and especially that sound, which is why there are so many recordings of Ulysses. People say it's just as good to listen to on tape as it is to read, because he puts things together so well. There's a section in the third chapter of Ulysses where Stephen is walking on a beach, and all the words have crackling sounds because he's walking on the seashells. So he's just meticulous in how he's crafting his language.
Brings all the textures into it. Was music part of his life growing up?
Definitely. He used to attend an open house. So it was every second and last Sunday of the month in a local politician's house. His name was David Sheehy, and he lived just around the corner from the Joyces. And Joyce's mother used to bring James and his little brother Stanislaus there to sing, play games, charades, music and stuff like that. So yeah, throughout his whole life, it's kind of in the background, and it's something he's certainly interested in. The Martello Tower, which is another Joyce museum beside the sea, have Joyce's guitar there that he used to play. And there's great photos of Joyce actually playing the guitar as well.
Did he have other musical instruments beside the guitar? Or?
I believe there was a piano as well, which I think is in the Irish Writers Center, which is just beside the James Joyce Cultural Center.
All right. Has your relationship with Joyce changed over the years?
I'm very suspicious of adoring one individual idol. So for a long time, I was really interested in Joyce, and I still am, but I've certainly folded him into a wider interest in other writers and how he kind of ping pongs off other writers. I still think, hugely influential individual. Just, I think 2 years ago, there was a short story set in Argentina based off of the Araby short story in Dubliners. And as I said, like, just because they're set in Dublin, the stories are pretty universal. And that's what's, I think, the best bit about Joyce is we get people in the Joyce Center who visit from all over, who some of them, for example, some visitors a few years ago came over from Hungary and they were able to recognize words in Hungarian from Ulysses that I wouldn't know. And they kind of just shone an extra light. Or people from the States who come over all the time, often amazing kind of stories that come out of, because universities in the States have, and secondary schools, or high schools, I should say, have a much better reputation for teaching Joyce than we do. We don't learn Joyce in secondary school. If you go to undergrad, you might come across Joyce, but it certainly doesn't cross our paths as much as it seems to for American readers.
Oh, interesting.
So that's what I like about it, is that before I was interested in the local part of Joyce, recognizing the street names, going to them, visiting, the house where Bloom lived, where the plaque is. And now I'm more interested in the universal aspect, where I can hear what people from anywhere in the world can yield to me about their interest or what they've spotted in it,
I found this great quote off Wikipedia. For myself, I always write about Dublin, because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world. And the particular is contained the universal.
Yes. And he said as well, when I die, Dublin will be written on my heart. He may have spent most of his life then outside of Dublin. And oftentimes, that complicated relationship, he loved it as long as he could be away from it, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there is obviously that sentimentality for Dublin. I mean, he sets all his works there,
What would you say delights you about Joyce?
He's funny. People don't give him credit. He's funny. Like, when people mention Ulysses, they think of this tome of modernism, but there's fart jokes in it. Do you know what I mean? Leopold Bloom is thinking about Robert Emmet, a famous Irish patriot who was martyred. And he's thinking of that famous Robert Emmet quote that says, "Not till my nation has taken its place among the countries of the earth, let my epitaph be writ." And Leopold Bloom's thinking about it, and he just farts while he's thinking about it. And it's like Joyce writes the fart over the quote. So he's funny. He has witty jokes and slightly less witty jokes. He was, He was interested in scatology, or scatologically interested. He was interested in the toilet and the workings of toilet politics, so to speak. So I think he's really funny throughout his works. And even when sometimes it's satire and you mightn't get it because, someone who's reading it in Colorado or wherever has never been to a Dublin pub and had to listen to someone sitting on a bar stool talking drivel for 2 hours. But Joyce wrote that into, the Cyclops episode of Ulysses, and that's the particular, and then you get the more kind of universal funny aspects.
Right. Yeah. So if you found yourself in a pub with Joyce, what would you want to talk to him about or ask him? That's
a good question. I've never been asked that in all my years of working in the Joyce Center. I don't know. One thing that's probably worth noting is there's a book called the Oxford Book of Literary Anecdotes, and Joyce is in it. It said that he was always interested in what you had to say, no matter who you were. So that's encouraging anyway, because oftentimes, they say don't meet your heroes, but it does sound like Joyce would certainly sit down with his glass of Swiss white wine and he would listen to what you had to say about anything and everything. Or he said you could tell a lot about a person's life philosophy by the way they eat an egg. So going back to what you said about the particular and the universal, I would be curious I don't know. That's a good question now. You've stumped me. But I would certainly be curious to hear what his next book would have been, I think. I would love to have known how he would go from that huge Finnegans Wake and, because bear in mind, Finnegans Wake alienated a lot of his supporters, including his brother including other people like Ezra Pound. They thought he was kind of past it. And Samuel Beckett and a few other authors wrote a defense. It was like nearly a pamphlet. It was a defense of what he was working on. So I would be curious to see how he would get down from that, that intense headspace to make up your own language. How would he transition into this small, simple book? And yeah, that's what I'd ask, I think.
Yeah, that where is after Finnegans Wake? Where do we go from there? Right?
Yeah, what's left?
I could see maybe bringing it down to something small and simple, just to kind of bring yourself back down to earth, and then what next? And I'm struck by what you said earlier. Just a man that seems genuinely curious about life and about people, and just loved it. Wants to get to know everybody because he's fitting that into his worldview of being able to look at all these different perspectives. And we touched into the political and the religious, I guess, here and there, but did he, there's the love of Parnell and wanting to kind of carry forward with that, I think, and maybe break free of the church. Did he have fairly strong, well-developed views on these things that he continued to promote outside of his books? Or
religion, like he wouldn't have been an activist now or anything, or he wouldn't, kind of speak about it too much. Like, he was interested in things, there's a story with Nora where he was talking about the rise of fascism, and not in any I appreciate it or I don't, but just commenting on it like it's in the news. And Nora said, if you speak one more time about that Hitler man kind of thing. So he was just always aware, and he was always trying to keep abreast of topics. And certainly when he died, Nora was asked if she wanted a religious ceremony for the funeral, and she said, I couldn't do that to poor Jim. So he did keep that distrust of the institution of Catholicism, certainly, and the practice and its kind of pervasive tentacles in all aspects of daily life in Ireland. And the political thing, the nationalism thing, is more, again, he didn't see the point in going in circles, especially, as I said, when he was looking across and he saw amazing work in art, literature, music being done around the world. And Ireland, to him, seemed to just be going in circles. And you had great thinkers like Yeats and Lady Gregory, and all they were doing was rehashing old Irish myths. So I think he's certainly just a little frustrated rather than ever peddling his own political interests. He's open-minded. In the novel, Leopold Bloom says, I'm talking about love, the opposite of hatred. Love loves to love love. And that's a quote we often see on postcards everywhere, and it does resonate with that just go at it kind of thing,
Right. I get the impression of just somebody that's observing human nature, whether it's the common man at the bar stool next to him or the political landscape of continental Europe, and just kind of observing it all and taking it in, and a little frustrated with the stagnation of politics, but mostly seems to be expressing himself through his writing and doing his thing through that.
And, he meets a lot of various people throughout his career. Like, he's, as I said, he's so open to meeting anyone and everyone. And, he famously meets Hemingway quite a bit. Joyce would insult someone in a bar, and then he would say, deal with him, Hemingway, and let the slightly less scrawny individual step forward. Or, he meets F. Scott Fitzgerald, and Scott Fitzgerald says, can I kiss the hand that wrote Ulysses? And Joyce says, it's done a lot of other things as well. So, he's just, it kind of water off a duck's back for him. Nothing kind of seems to dig in.
Keeps it humble as well.
Yeah, certainly.
Great. Loic, I really thank you for your time here.
Absolutely. Happy to take part in the outreach and help share the word about Joyce.
It was great. I learned a lot.
Hopefully we'll see you in Dublin next June for Bloomsday.
Sounds great. That concludes our episode. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed it. A big thank you to Loic Wright for taking the time to talk with us. You can find Loic on Twitter at Duffels1. Thank you to Christina Pearson and Richard Rossa of Hilaritas Press. And thank you to producer Ryan Reeves for putting it all together. With this, the conclusion of our 8-part series, we will open up our format with our next episode with Antero Ollie, releasing on the 23rd of May. Until then, I am your host, Mike Gathers, signing off with love and cheerfulness. Amor y Hilaritas.
That was a great day.
Hilaritas.